It's that time of year. Let's start our seedlings. I'm going to talk about how I start my seedlings in my relatively small space in my apartment in Brooklyn. Let's go. Okay, we're going to start with some kind of container. I sometimes use real seed trays and sometimes I use baking trays. Whatever you have that is tray-ish should work. And I like to start all my seeds with these cocoa coir um, pellets because they are space saving and they allow me to move seedlings around one by one as they germinate and then as they get their true leaves. So it's mostly about space. So you're going to fill your tray with pellets. You could use peat moss pellets if you prefer. I like to use whichever ones are cheap. So you'll notice as I go through this that these are not super high quality pellets, but they work just fine for my purposes. So I'm going to fill my tray with the pellets. That's step one. And then we're going to put some water in the tray to wet the pellets, and they'll all expand and get fluffy. Then I'm going to take the little bullet pieces off, and some pellets don't have these. They do make it more time consuming, but basically it's like a little hole that's been cut out of the top of the fabric, the ag fabric, that you can remove so that you have access to the cocoa coir. And in this process, I also fluff them up. So I squeeze them. You'll notice each time I pick one up, I squeeze it a little bit and I'm just making it a little fluffier so that the cocoa coir is a little softer and easier for the seeds to germinate in. And then, of course, for the roots to grow through, yada, yada. So we're going to do this one by one to each piece, but I'm going to skip some of it because it's boring to watch. Now we have all of our pellets that are ready for seeds. So I'm going to take my seeds and use this little dibbler tool, but really you can use anything. Sometimes I very often use a paintbrush actually. This little tool just happened to come with these particular pellets, so I used it. But you're going to just make a little indentation in the pellet so that you can put your seeds in. And you're going to follow the instructions on your seed packet for this. A lot of seeds like to be placed about a 1/4 inch under the soil, but you really should follow your instructions or Google it and look up whatever particular thing you're planting, what depth. These are, I think, pepper seeds, if I remember correctly. When it's really early, I start with peppers and tomatoes because those take a long time to mature. And that's a good way to make choices as to how you, what order in which you plant your seeds initially. Um, Look at your time to maturity, and the longer the time to maturity, the earlier in your season you want to seed those particular items. And then, of course, you want to make labels. This is a choice that I make that is more time consuming because I put one label in each one of these little pellets. I do this because my space is limited. So I live in New York City in an apartment, and I don't have just tons and tons of space. I don't have a garage or a basement or anything like that where I can do all of this work. So I'm doing it in my apartment. As a result, I want to be able to move these things around one by one. And as we get further into this, I'm going to show you what I do as far as when I move things and why. But once the seeds start to germinate, I want to pull them out one by one and move them to a different spot, which I'll talk about in a second. So you'll notice that each of my labels has a date and the name of whatever it is I seeded in that particular pellet. So we're going to do that for every single one of the pellets. Once I have all my pellets seeded, I'm going to cover my tray either with a humidity dome if it's a regular seed tray or with a plastic bag. This is like a produce bag. And I'm going to place it onto a heat mat under a light because some of my seeds need light to germinate. After I've done this, this is a different seed tray, you'll notice, but the same concept. After I've seeded everything, I check my trays every single day. And I'm looking for seedlings that have germinated because once they germinate and that little sprout grows, they don't want to be on the heat anymore. One of the things that will cause your seedlings to get super leggy or really long and weak is having them on heat after they've germinated because that then it just tries to escape the heat. So as soon as each one germinates and I can see that it has a stem poking through, and sometimes even before that, when I just like this one right here, whenever I can see just a little bit coming out, I will pull them off of the heat and move them to a different tray that's only under light at that point because I don't need it to continue to be on heat. And you also want to get it out of the serious humidity. So, in other words, take off the humidity dome, but I want to keep all of these that haven't yet germinated under the humidity dome. So I'm going to leave them and I'm just going to move out the seedlings that have germinated and place them in a different tray with no humidity dome and no heat under them. And you'll notice that I'm spraying here, and that's because some of them have developed a little bit of mold on the top, and I'm spraying them with a diluted solution of hydrogen peroxide just to take care of that mold. Once your seedlings have sprouted, you're going to need to thin them. And I usually wait until they're about an inch tall or so. And you're going to look at your pellet and try to pick out the one or two or three, depending on what it is that you're growing, that you want to keep. And you're going to pull out the rest. Sometimes pulling them out will disturb the roots of the remaining ones a little bit too much, so you can just pinch them off if you prefer. A lot of gardeners just pinch them instead of pulling them. And for me, it just kind of depends on what it looks like and whether I think I can pull them out successfully without messing up the ones that I'm going to keep. This is lime basil, and I know that it should be fine with me pulling them, and it'll also be fine to leave two or three. By the way, strongest seedling does not always mean tallest. Sometimes the best looking seedling might be a shorter one. You just want to keep the one that looks the healthiest and the strongest. And then I'm going to put it back on the tray and put it back under the lights and let it keep growing. This one is Amaranth, Love Lies Bleeding. This one is a little bit more delicate. I've grown it before, and that's why I'm trimming it instead of pulling them, because I fear that if I pulled those out, it might just really destroy the roots of the ones that I'm going to keep. That one's teeny tiny, so I was able to just pull it out. So you're going to do this for all of your seedlings, and you can see in this view that I've already thinned a lot of these. You want to do it when they're about an inch tall so that they're strong enough that you're not going to destroy the ones that you're leaving. But they're still small enough that it's easy to thin and you haven't sacrificed the growth of the ones you're going to keep by keeping them too long. And one other side note, I'm not going to water these unless they look dry. And if you look at the bottom left here, you can see that a few of these look very light brown. Those need water. And until they have their first set of true leaves, I'm only going to use water, no fertilizer at all, because we don't want to kill them. Fertilizer can be too much for them when they're teeny tiny little babies. So only water, only water if it's visibly dry. So you can see here that this one is not dry. It's still wet. See how the cocoa core still looks dark? But this one is getting dry. It definitely needs a drink. So we're going to water only the ones that are visibly dry, where you can see that the cocoa core is lighter in color. I also can tell when I pick them up because they'll feel light, physically light. But you don't want to overwater them because that is what can cause dampening off, which will kill them. So you want to keep them moist, but you don't want to drown them. After a little time passes, you're going to start to look for the first set of true leaves. So the very first leaves are the cotyledon leaves. They're like the embryo leaves for the plant. Those very first leaves are usually kind of nondescript, and you'll notice as I'm picking up each of these, I'm looking for ones that have a set of true leaves. So this is some kind of squash probably, or a cucumber, just looking at the shape of that first true leaf. Um, so we're looking for the true leaves because this is a sign that it's time to start fertilizing it. So I want to pull out all of the ones that have a first set of true leaves, and I'm going to move them to a separate tray so that I can water them with fertilized water. And I'll explain that to you in 1 second. You'll notice I'm also continuing to thin. So I initially left 2 seedlings in that pod, and one of them was really not thriving, so I yanked it out. So I'm going through all of them, and I'm just pulling out every little seedling that has a set of true leaves and moving it to a different container so that I can feed it with fertilizer. And occasionally you're going to find one where the seed coating has not come off and the leaves are not opening. Now, generally speaking, you just want to leave that alone and wait, but sometimes you need to pull that seed coating off or it's not going to survive. And I'm not going to lie, sometimes when you pull that seed coating off, it's going to rip the leaves off and then it's a goner, it's going to die. Um, but sometimes it's going to die anyway if the seed coating doesn't come off. So don't jump the gun on pulling off seed coating, but if you see one that has been that way for days, it germinated days ago, and it's still sitting there with the seed coating trapping the leaves, you want to very carefully and gently try to get it off. Now it is time to start feeding our seedlings. So this is the fertilizer I'm using. It's really better to have an even NPK ratio, like 4:4:4, but I have this, and so this is what I'm going to use. Whatever fertilizer you use, you want to check the label and see what it tells you to use for seedlings. If it doesn't say, you need to heavily dilute what you would normally use. Baby seedlings are delicate, and so you don't want to kill them with fertilizer. That's why you need to dilute it. So I did a half a teaspoon, as the label told me to a gallon of water for my first feeding of the babies. Pour that fertilizer into your water. I usually also rinse my little measuring cup with the water so I make sure I'm using all my fertilizer and mix it in. And then I pour it into a smaller watering can so that I have a little bit more control over where the water goes. Obviously, my big one doesn't have a lot of control. And now you're going to water your baby seedlings. Remember, this is only once they have their first true leaves. And I generally bottom water. These seedlings that you're looking at actually probably don't quite need water yet, but I was doing this demo, and so I watered them a little bit early. And I'm going to let it just sit in that pool of water and soak it for maybe half an hour. Just let it take it up, but you don't want to leave it in the pool of water after that. You want to make sure you get the rest of that remaining water out of the bottom of the tray or move them to a different tray that's dry. Eventually, you will need to pot up your seedlings because they're going to outgrow these little pellets fairly quickly. So these, you can see they already have roots that are growing out of them. So I'm going to go ahead and pot them up. I could probably let them go a little bit longer, but once you start to really see roots breaking through, it's about time to give them more space. So this is a 50-50 mix of coco coir and perlite, and I'm adding this mycorrhizal inoculant, which really helps in root development. Mycorrhizal is a fungus, and it creates a symbiotic relationship with the roots of your plants and is highly beneficial. So I'm going to mix in a little bit of the inoculant into the coco coir perlite mixture. And if I have worm castings available, I would also add some worm castings to this mixture. My worm castings are currently just not mature. They're not quite ready, so I didn't put any in this particular example. But I'm going to mix in the inoculant and then just pot it up into a slightly bigger pot. I usually cut the fabric a little bit if I can. If it has tons of roots, sometimes you can't do this, but I feel like it does give it a little bit more space to expand those roots, and I worry less that it's going to get choked out. When you're potting up a tomato plant, this is a tomato, you see all those little fuzzy things on the stem? All of those can become roots. So to have the strongest possible tomato plant, when you pot it up, you want it to be deeper than it was before. You can put it into the soil all the way up to almost the bottom of the first leaves. And this will give you a much stronger tomato plant in the long run because all of that entire stem that had all those fuzzies on it, all of that will develop into roots and you have a stronger, hardier plant in the long run. So pot those babies up whenever they get a little bit too big for their pellets, and we'll keep growing. Once everything's done, you want to get them back under your grow lights, obviously. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how I just put grow lights in random places in my apartment. Um, Anywhere that I can fit seedlings and grow lights at this time of year, I will put seedlings and grow lights in that spot. So here are a few of the places and ways that I put my seedlings under lights. This is a space that I've created that's in the back of where I have a bunch of houseplants. And this is where I germinate my seeds. So I don't really care if they're close enough to the grow light. It's mostly about the heat and having some light there. This is a vintage light fixture that I adapted with some grow lights. This is a shop light with a Scentsy bulb in it and a cake pan underneath in the middle of a lot of my houseplants. Uh, this is my living room. This is another shop light. There are many ways that you can add grow lights, even in a small New York City apartment. Before we know it, we'll be taking these outside and hardening them off for planting.